Picture this under the cover of darkness, in the shadow of towering windmills. Small groups gather in hushed whispers. The air is thick with tension, every creak of the wooden beams a potential warning. These aren't secret meetings of rebels plotting an uprising, at least not in the traditional sense. These are students and teachers risking everything for something far more dangerous: knowledge. Welcome to the hidden world of the midnight schools, where education wasn't just a privilege, it was an act of defiance. During some of Europe's most turbulent religious wars, when ideas could get you killed and books were seen as threats, these clandestine classrooms became sanctuaries for thinkers, dreamers, and seekers of truth. It's easy to take for granted today how freely we can access learning, libraries at our fingertips, schools in every town. But there was a time when the simple act of reading the wrong book or questioning the wrong doctrine could mean exile, imprisonment, or worse. That's what makes the story of the midnight schools so extraordinary. These weren't just places of study, they were lifelines, preserving philosophy, science, and literature while wars raged outside. Think about the courage it took to teach geometry by candlelight, knowing a single slip could bring soldiers to your door, or the determination of students who memorized entire texts because carrying them was too risky. This is a story of resilience, creativity, and the unshakable belief that knowledge is worth protecting, no matter the cost. So how did windmills, those iconic symbols of rural life, become the unlikely strongholds of learning? And who were the daring minds who turned them into secret hubs of intellectual rebellion? Over the next few minutes, we'll peel back the layers of history to uncover how these hidden schools operated, the ingenious methods they used to evade detection, and the lasting impact they had on the world we live in today. This isn't just a tale of the past, it's a reminder of what happens when people refuse to let ideas be extinguished. So settle in, because the story of the midnight schools is about to take you on a journey where every page turned was a small victory, and every lesson taught was a spark that refused to die. The 16th and 17th centuries were a time when Europe was torn apart by faith. What began as theological debates soon erupted into full-scale wars, with Protestant and Catholic armies marching across the continent, leaving burned villages and shattered lives in their wake. But the violence wasn't just on the battlefield, it seeped into every aspect of society, especially the world of ideas. Authorities on both sides saw unapproved knowledge as a threat, banning books, shutting down universities, and hunting scholars who dared to teach anything outside approved doctrine. Imagine living in a world where owning the wrong text could label you a heretic, where discussing science or philosophy in public might mean imprisonment or worse. This was the reality that gave birth to the midnight schools. As crackdowns intensified, teachers and students found themselves with an impossible choice: abandon learning or find a way to keep it alive in secret. And so, in the quiet hours when watchful eyes were least likely to notice, they gathered, sometimes in cellars, sometimes in attics, but most famously in the towering windmills that dotted the countryside. These structures, often isolated and full of noise from grinding gears, provided the perfect cover. The constant turning of the sails masked hushed voices, while the thick stone walls kept candlelight from betraying those inside. What's remarkable is how these schools adapted to survive. Lessons were taught from memory to avoid incriminating paper trails. Texts were copied in code or disguised as harmless religious tracts. Some teachers even used the rhythmic clatter of the mill's machinery to time their lectures, pausing whenever the sound changed to avoid detection. It was a delicate dance, one mistake away from disaster, yet the risk only sharpened their determination. Because for every book burned by censors, a dozen more were being committed to memory. For every scholar driven into exile, another stepped forward to teach in secret. The midnight schools weren't just hiding knowledge, they were keeping it alive, one whispered lesson at a time. Windmills weren't just convenient hiding places, they were poetic symbols of defiance. Picture these towering structures standing alone in open fields, their sails catching every gust of wind. To most people, they were simply machines for grinding grain, but to the teachers and students of the midnight schools, they represented something far deeper. Just as a windmill harnesses the chaotic force of the wind to create something useful, these hidden classrooms transformed the oppressive atmosphere of religious conflict into fuel for learning. The very isolation that made windmills practical for milling also made them ideal for secrecy. Far from crowded town squares or patrolled city streets, they operated on the edges of society, where suspicious eyes rarely wandered. But the genius of using windmills went beyond location. Think about the sounds they produced: the rhythmic creaking of wooden gears, the steady whoosh of turning sails. These natural noises provided perfect cover for murmured lectures and quiet debates. A sudden pause in conversation could be disguised as just another lull in the wind. Even the flicker of candlelight was less suspicious here. After all, millers often worked late into the night. It was a masterclass in blending in, using the ordinary to hide the extraordinary. At the heart of this system were the unsung heroes of the midnight schools, the teachers who risked everything to keep knowledge alive. Many were former university professors, exiled for their unapproved teachings or unconventional ideas. Others were local scholars, ordinary men and women who refused to let fear dictate what could or couldn't be learned. They didn't just recite facts, they taught their students how to think critically, question boldly, and memorize entire texts in case written copies were seized. Some even devised clever codes, embedding forbidden knowledge into seemingly harmless songs or folk tales. These educators weren't just passing along information, they were preserving entire ways of thinking that authorities sought to erase. And then there were the students whose hunger for learning outweighed the very real dangers they faced. Imagine walking miles through the dark, avoiding patrols, just to spend a few hours hunched over a single shared book. Some traveled in disguise, pretending to be delivering grain or making routine repairs. Others memorized intricate knock patterns to signal their arrival without words. What's striking is how young many of them were: teenagers and even children, willing to risk their futures for a chance to learn. Their courage turned windmills into more than just buildings. They became beacons of hope in a world that had tried to snuff out curiosity. The legacy of these hidden classrooms stretches far beyond their time. Many of the ideas preserved in those whispered lessons would later fuel the Enlightenment, shaping modern science, philosophy, and education. But perhaps their greatest lesson isn't found in any textbook. It's the reminder that knowledge, once kindled, is nearly impossible to extinguish. Even in the darkest hours, people will always find ways to learn, to question, and to pass the light forward. And sometimes all it takes is a quiet space, a trusted teacher, and the relentless turning of the wind. Behind every midnight school was a figure like Vanderwowed, a man who could have lived quietly under the radar, but chose instead to become a smuggler of ideas. Once a respected philosophy professor at Leuven, he found himself branded a criminal overnight when new edicts banned his teachings. But rather than flee abroad like many of his colleagues, Vanderwowed stayed, disappearing into the countryside where he transformed empty barns and disused windmills into classrooms. His story wasn't unique. Across Europe, hundreds of educated men and women made the same dangerous choice, becoming the invisible architects of this underground education network. What made these organizers so remarkable wasn't just their knowledge, it was their logistical brilliance. Think about the precision required to run a secret school in an era without phones or fast travel. They established coded messages using laundry hung on lines or specific arrangements of market stall goods to signal safe meeting times. Some posed as traveling merchants, their carts hiding books beneath sacks of flour. Others recruited millers and bakers as allies, trading free bread for the use of their premises after dark. The most successful organizers operated like military strategists, mapping out escape routes through back alleys and fields, always one step ahead of informants. Women played an often overlooked role in this shadow system. While historical records focus on male scholars, letters and trial documents reveal how wives of tradesmen frequently acted as couriers, sewing forbidden texts into the linings of clothing or hiding them in hollowed-out loaves of bread. In Antwerp, a linen draper named Margaret de Vos ran one of the longest operating midnight schools from her attic, using her shop's steady stream of customers as cover for student arrivals. Her ledger books, later discovered by historians, showed meticulous accounting not for fabric sales, but for candles, ink, and bribes to local guards. The true genius of these organizers lay in their adaptability. When authorities started searching windmills, classes moved to fishing boats on foggy mornings. When book seizures increased, they developed elaborate memorization games where students would recite passages in rounds, reinforcing knowledge through repetition. Some even staged fake religious study groups as decoys, filling front rooms with approved texts while real lessons happened in hidden back chambers. Their methods were as diverse as their backgrounds. Former monks taught memory techniques from medieval manuscript traditions, while apothecaries used herb-drying racks to hide coded notes among medicinal plants. What united them all was an unshakable conviction that ideas couldn't be owned or outlawed. Jan Vanderwowed himself was eventually captured, but not before training dozens of successors who continued his work. At his trial, when asked why he risked so much for something as intangible as knowledge, his reported reply was simple: "You can burn a book, but you cannot unlearn what it contains." This quiet defiance echoed through every midnight school, where the real curriculum wasn't just astronomy or mathematics. It was the radical notion that thinking freely was worth any price. The curriculum of the midnight schools would astonish anyone who imagines underground education as rudimentary or survivalist. These weren't makeshift lessons in basic literacy. They were vibrant intellectual hubs where students debated Copernicus under flickering candlelight, practiced anatomy with smuggled medical texts, and recited Homer in hushed Greek. The very subjects that made them targets: astronomy challenging earthly authority, medicine exploring the body without theological constraints, philosophy questioning dogma became their acts of quiet rebellion. A single page of Galileo's work, painstakingly copied and passed hand to hand, carried more danger than a loaded pistol in that climate. Yet students still gathered, their hunger for knowledge outweighing the very real risk that tonight's astronomy lesson might be interrupted by soldiers at the door. What's fascinating is how these forbidden subjects were taught. Without reliable access to books, educators developed ingenious methods. Mathematics problems were scratched onto millstones and wiped clean before dawn. Medical students memorized human anatomy by associating bones and organs with parts of the windmill itself. The sail became the ribcage, the grinding stones the joints. One recovered diary describes a poetry class where verses were translated into laundry symbols, allowing students to read them while pretending to hang washing. This wasn't just education in hiding, it was knowledge transformed into something fluid, portable, and resilient. The true brilliance lay in how these schools connected disparate fields. A single evening's discussion might weave together Arabic mathematics, Jewish medical texts, and Protestant translations of Plato, precisely the cross-pollination of ideas that authorities feared most. In doing so, they preserved not just individual subjects but the very concept of interdisciplinary thought. When a theology student dissected a sheep's heart to understand circulation, or a miller's daughter calculated grain ratios using algebra from Baghdad, they were stitching together a tapestry of understanding that no book burning could fully unravel. Surviving lesson fragments reveal how these clandestine classrooms shaped future thinkers. A young man who memorized Vesalius' anatomical drawings in a Dutch windmill might later advance surgical techniques in Leiden. A woman taught celestial navigation by a fugitive astronomer could eventually influence naval exploration. Like underground rivers surfacing miles from their origins, the ideas nurtured in these hidden schools would emerge decades later in laboratories, universities, and the very foundations of the Enlightenment. The midnight schools didn't just keep knowledge alive, they turned oppression into fertilizer for intellectual revolutions none of their students lived to see. Perhaps most remarkably, this underground network created something rare in any era, a truly meritocratic education. With no official degrees to award or social status to uphold, teachers judged students solely by their curiosity and capacity. Apprentices debated masters as equals when the topic demanded it. Women excluded from universities found mentors willing to share advanced texts. The miller's son with a gift for numbers might receive the same attention as a nobleman's heir. In shadows where traditional hierarchies held no power, knowledge became the only currency that mattered. The legacy of these curricula lingers in unexpected places. Modern medical diagrams still use some of the memory techniques developed to teach anatomy without textbooks. The Socratic method, kept alive in those hidden discussions, resurged in Enlightenment salons. Even our contemporary debates about academic freedom carry echoes of those windmill classrooms, proof that some battles over who gets to learn what never truly end. The students may have blown out their candles before dawn, but the sparks they kept alive would eventually help illuminate the world. The journey to a midnight school began long before reaching the windmill's shadow. For a young apprentice like Pieter, the son of a Leiden cloth merchant, it started with a heart-pounding ritual, leaving home under the pretense of fetching water, then doubling back through unlit alleys where stray dogs knew his footsteps better than the night watchman. His satchel held no books, just a wedge of cheese wrapped in cloth, its wax seal hiding a scrap of parchment with that evening's geometry problem. Every creaking shutter or distant laugh sent him flattening against walls, his pulse echoing the windmill's distant groan. The real test came at the mill's base, where he'd pause to trace a charcoal mark on the third step, a silent signal to those above that he came unobserved. Once inside, the atmosphere crackled with a mix of terror and exhilaration. 20 students might pack the upper chamber, their ages spanning from grizzled apothecaries to wide-eyed 12-year-olds like Pieter. No desks here, lessons happened cross-legged on flour-dusted planks, with a single candle positioned to cast shadows away from the slatted windows. The teacher, a former university lecturer named Master Hendrik, spoke in measured tones just loud enough to compete with the sail's rhythmic swoosh. His most prized possession wasn't the battered Euclid's Elements hidden in a flour bin, but the wooden tally stick he used to track attendance. Each notch represented a student who'd survived another month without arrest. What's striking is how these conditions forged extraordinary focus. With paper scarce, students wrote solutions in flour dust smoothed across the floor, erasing them with a sleeve before dawn. Advanced pupils mastered the art of bookless recitation, committing entire chapters to memory through call and response drills timed to the mill's machinery. A chemistry demonstration might use the mill's own mechanisms, comparing gear ratios to atomic theory, or grinding herbs between stones to discuss medicinal compounds. Every sense became a tool: the smell of overheating axle grease warning of approaching patrols, the taste of ink hastily licked from fingers when footsteps sounded below. Trust was the fragile currency that kept this world alive. Newcomers underwent weeks of observation before being taught anything controversial. A misplaced question about another student's hometown could end a friendship instantly. Loose tongues got people killed. Yet within these walls, hierarchies melted away. The baker's daughter correcting a nobleman's Latin, or a fugitive monk learning algebra from a 15-year-old wasn't just accepted, it was necessary. When survival depended on collective wit, pedigree meant nothing next to quick thinking. The emotional toll rarely surfaced openly, but traces remain in smuggled letters. One student's note to his sister captures the duality. "Tonight we passed Ovid by candle flame, laughing at how Jupiter's disguises pale beside our own. Then the sails jammed, and for 3 breaths we were statues, ears straining, was it the wind or boots on the ladder?" This constant tension reshaped their very relationship to knowledge. Unlike university scholars debating for prestige, these students fought for understanding like starving men savoring crumbs. When Pieter finally deciphered Archimedes' principle using only a water bucket and the mill's counterweights, his quiet aha carried the weight of 100 near misses. By dawn's first light, the classroom dissolved like mist. Students staggered departures, some slipping into Miller's smocks, others folding precious notes into hat linings. Those traveling far carried alibi bundles, market goods arranged to explain pre-dawn activity if stopped. The mill itself showed no trace beyond a few scuffed diagrams in the dust, already fading as the day's first grain shipment arrived. Yet beneath the surface, something irreversible had happened. However briefly, these fugitive scholars had tasted a truth authorities couldn't suppress: that ideas once kindled in willing minds become wildfire. And no amount of soldiers, edicts, or burned books could stamp out every spark. The art of concealment reached astonishing heights in the midnight schools, where scholars turned everyday objects into vessels of forbidden knowledge. Take something as ordinary as a baker's recipe to prying eyes. It might list ingredients for rye bread, but to initiates, the measurements held encrypted coordinates for safe houses. Flour quantities corresponded to dates, while rising times indicated meeting hours. This wasn't just code, it was survival poetry, where a misplaced decimal could mean imprisonment. Some of the most effective ciphers hid in plain sight, like the butterfly books, devotional texts where the real message emerged only when readers connected inked wing patterns across facing pages. Music became another powerful tool. Hymn books contained melodies where the intervals between notes spelled out names of exiled philosophers. A particularly clever instructor in Flanders taught logic through children's clapping games, with each rhythm representing syllogisms. Even laundry drying online sent signals, the arrangement of shirts and stockings indicating which texts had been smuggled in that week. The genius lay in using mundane activities as camouflage, ensuring that if authorities searched a student's satchel, they'd find nothing more suspicious than shopping lists or love letters. The most daring innovations happened in the margins. Printed books from approved presses became canvases for rebellion, their blank spaces filled with microscopic annotations. A pious-looking Bible might contain entire chapters of Lucretius' atomic theory scribbled between verses, while geometry diagrams in arithmetic textbooks concealed maps to hidden libraries. Some scholars perfected ink shifting, using mixtures that appeared faint or vanished entirely unless held at specific angles to light. These techniques transformed every scrap of paper into a dual-layered text, one for censors, another for those who knew how to look. What's remarkable is how these methods mirrored the windmills themselves. Just as the schools used ordinary structures to hide extraordinary lessons, their cryptography turned the commonplace into conduits for radical thought. A miller's account book might seem filled with grain transactions, but the flour prices tracked the movement of band scholars across Europe. The system worked because it exploited a fundamental blind spot of authorities. They expected subversion to look dramatic, not like a housewife humming folk songs or a merchant tallying barrels. This legacy of creative resistance echoes far beyond the 17th century. Modern digital encryption owes conceptual debts to those windmill scholars who first embedded messages in noise. The very principle of steganography, hiding data within harmless carriers, traces back to their disguised texts and coded laundry. Even today's protest movements use similar tactics, whether embedding messages in knitting patterns or coordinating through gaming platforms. The midnight schools didn't just preserve knowledge, they pioneered an entire philosophy of intellectual resistance, proving that when ideas are forced underground, they don't disappear, they evolve. While the story of the midnight schools often focuses on famous male scholars, the truth is women formed the backbone of this underground network, not just as students but as its daring architects. Take Anna Maria van Sherman, a noblewoman whose Utrecht townhouse became a hub for clandestine learning. By day, she hosted respectable gatherings of embroiderers and musicians. By night, the same rooms filled with whispered debates about Cartesian philosophy and smuggled anatomical drawings. Her genius lay in leveraging society's assumptions who would suspect a woman's sewing circle of harboring forbidden texts between fabric samples. But Van Sherman was far from alone. Across Europe, women turned domestic spaces into sanctuaries for knowledge. In Antwerp, brewer's wife Clara Peters ran a midnight school from her cellar, using beer deliveries to disguise the movement of books. Her ledgers, later discovered hidden in an ale barrel, reveal how she bartered hops for tutoring 2 sacks of barley equaled an hour of Greek lessons. Meanwhile, in rural Friesland, midwife Margareta de Heer used her profession as cover, carrying medical texts in her birthing kit and teaching anatomy to apprentices while ostensibly tending to newborns. These women didn't just participate in the system, they reimagined it, using their societal invisibility as a shield for radical education. The most dangerous work fell to those who transcribed texts. Imagine spending nights hunched over vellum, copying Galileo's forbidden star charts by faint candlelight, knowing a single dropped page could doom your entire household. Women like Lisbeth Dirks, a pastor's daughter in Haarlem, perfected the art of needlepoint cipher, stitching scientific diagrams into tapestry patterns that could be unraveled and reassembled as needed. Others developed kettle ink, a mixture that disappeared when heated, allowing notes to vanish instantly if authorities raided a kitchen. Their innovations went beyond preservation. They transformed domestic tools into weapons of intellectual resistance. What's often overlooked is how these efforts challenged gender norms in ways that reverberated far beyond the classroom. When a merchant's widow like Cornelia van Nispen taught mathematics to both sons and daughters in her attic, she wasn't just defying educational bans, she was quietly dismantling centuries of tradition. The very act of women teaching philosophy or physics, even in secret, planted seeds for future feminist thought. Some of these educators paid dearly for their audacity. Court records show at least 12 women executed for heretical instruction in the Dutch Republic alone. Yet their legacy endured in the girls they taught, who grew up knowing knowledge had no gender. Perhaps the most poignant testament lies in the mother books, handwritten primers women created for their children, blending approved religious verses with hidden lessons in logic and science. One surviving example from Ghent contains a seemingly simple bedtime prayer that, when certain letters are read vertically, reveals instructions for building an astrolabe. These dual-purpose texts did more than circumvent censorship. They embedded the spirit of inquiry into daily life, proving that education could flourish even when forced into the shadows. The impact of these women extended far beyond their lifetimes. Many Enlightenment salons, often credited as birthplaces of modern feminism, were directly inspired by the secret networks these educators built. When 18th-century thinkers argued for women's right to learn, they stood on the shoulders of those who had already proven it possible, one covert lesson at a time. The midnight schools didn't just preserve knowledge, they demonstrated that intellectual hunger recognizes no boundaries, and that sometimes the quietest voices spark the loudest revolutions. The geography of resistance was as varied as the people who kept knowledge alive. While Dutch windmills may be the most iconic symbols of hidden learning, the midnight schools took radically different forms depending on the landscape and local culture. In Poland, where dense forests provided natural cover, former monastic schools relocated to hunting lodges and woodcutters' cabins. These woodland classrooms used the environment itself as teaching tools. Botany lessons happened among the very plants being studied, while astronomy students navigated by the stars visible through canopy clearings. The forest's acoustics played a crucial role too. Instructors developed a system of bird call alerts that could signal danger or mark lesson transitions, turning nature into both classroom and sentry. France's underground libraries presented another ingenious adaptation. Beneath the streets of Lyon and Toulouse, networks of wine cellars, already equipped with climate-controlled vaults perfect for preserving manuscripts, became secret universities. Wealthy vintners who secretly sympathized with banned scholars would host tastings where the real vintage being sampled was knowledge. A bottle's vintage year might correspond to a specific text's hiding place, while the swirling motions used to aerate wine doubled as memory techniques for reciting poetry. The humid air that kept barrels from drying out also preserved delicate pages of smuggled scientific treatises, making these cellars accidental archives of forbidden thought. Even more surprising were the floating schools of the Venetian lagoon. Fishermen transformed their boats into mobile classrooms, using fishing nets to pass messages between vessels. When patrol boats appeared, lessons would instantly switch to demonstrations of proper net mending or fish gutting techniques. The water itself became a teaching aid. Tides illustrated lunar cycles, while navigational charts doubled as geometry primers. This maritime network was so effective that authorities reportedly grew suspicious of any gathering of more than 3 boats, forcing instructors to develop a system where knowledge passed sequentially from vessel to vessel like a scholarly relay race. What united these disparate locations was their clever use of local resources. Alpine villages held classes in cheese aging caves, where the strong smells masked lamp oil from patrols. Hungarian shepherds embedded philosophical debates into folk songs heard at seasonal migrations. Every environment presented unique advantages. The very isolation that made Polish forests dangerous also made them ideal for concealment, just as the social nature of French wine culture provided cover for intellectual exchange. This regional diversity proved oppressive regimes faced an impossible task. They couldn't ban windmills, forests, or fishing boats without crippling daily life, leaving just enough cracks in the system for light to slip through. The adaptability of these schools reveals a profound truth about the human drive to learn. When Dutch authorities started monitoring windmills, classes moved to peat barge hulls. When Polish forest patrols intensified, lessons shifted to charcoal burners' pits where the smoke hid gatherings. Each crackdown bred new innovations, proving that knowledge, like water, will always find its way through the tiniest openings. The geography of resistance wasn't just about hiding places. It was a living demonstration that no single authority could control how or where people choose to think. Perhaps most inspiring is how these regional differences created unexpected intellectual cross-pollination. A medical student might learn herbal remedies in a Polish forest one year, then compare notes with a French cellar scholar studying Arabic texts the next. The very necessity of moving between safe houses turned education into a migratory process where ideas traveled as fluidly as the people carrying them. This decentralized network became its own kind of university, one without walls or borders, where the curriculum was written in whispers and the lecture halls changed with the seasons. What emerges from these scattered fragments is a map not just of hiding places, but of hope. From windmill gears to wine racks, from fishing nets to charcoal pits, ordinary objects became guardians of extraordinary ideas. The landscape of learning had no center, and that was its greatest strength, because when knowledge lives everywhere in pieces, it becomes impossible to eradicate entirely. Authorities could burn a book, but they couldn't burn a forest. They could arrest a teacher, but not the echo of their voice across water. The midnight schools didn't just survive in these spaces, they turned geography itself into an ally, proving that sometimes the best place to hide is right in plain sight. The stories of near captures and last-second escapes from the midnight schools read like something from a spy novel, except these were real lives hanging in the balance. Take the case of Master Jarrett, a philosophy teacher in Groningen who developed an elaborate early warning system using the windmill's own mechanics. By tying fishing lines to specific gear teeth, he rigged the sails to emit a distinct groan when strangers approached, a sound students learned to distinguish from the mill's normal creaks. This system saved them twice, once allowing just enough time to stash forbidden texts inside hollowed-out millstones before soldiers stormed in. When questioned about the suspicious noise, Jarrett calmly blamed it on a warped cogwheel, even demonstrating how to reproduce the sound by hand. His quick thinking turned the mill's own anatomy into both classroom and camouflage. Not all escapes relied on machinery. In Flanders, a quick-witted student named Lisbeth devised an entire shadow curriculum based on laundry. When authorities unexpectedly searched her family's windmill, she seamlessly transformed an astronomy lesson into a demonstration of starching techniques, using the positions of hanging shirts to represent constellations. The soldiers left laughing at the silly girls playing with clothes, never realizing the laundry lines were actually a celestial map. This blend of creativity and calm under pressure became a hallmark of the school's survival. Another group in Utrecht avoided detection for months by pretending to be a traveling theater troupe rehearsing morality plays, their smuggled texts disguised as scripts with coded stage directions. The physical spaces themselves often held secrets within secrets. Some windmills featured scholars' steps, misaligned floorboards that creaked only under adult weight, alerting children to hide. Others had flower shoots modified into escape tunnels, or false walls where a person could stand motionless behind hanging sacks. The most ingenious might be the Haarlem mill, where the entire grinding mechanism could be shifted to reveal a hidden compartment beneath, a feat of engineering that took 3 years to construct in secret. These architectural tricks went beyond hiding places. They were physical manifestations of the adaptability that kept knowledge alive. What makes these close calls remarkable isn't just the narrowness of escape, but the psychological toll they reveal in surviving letters. A teacher writing to his brother describes teaching Plato's allegory of the cave while literally hiding in one. The irony was not lost on us, discussing shadows on the wall as our own flickered against the stone. Another account tells of a student vomiting from terror mid-lesson, only to return after composing herself because, as she put it, fear passes, but ignorance sticks. These weren't just daring adventurers, they were ordinary people who chose extraordinary risks for the sake of an idea that the mind should never be caged. The legacy of these near-misses lives on in unexpected ways. Modern emergency preparedness training draws from their decentralized alert systems, while cybersecurity experts study their encryption methods. But perhaps their greatest lesson is how fragile and resilient knowledge can be simultaneously. Every time a teacher paused mid-sentence at an unusual sound, every student who memorized a text just before burning it, these were acts of faith in a future they might not live to see. That faith was rewarded centuries later when scholars tracing the roots of the Enlightenment found fingerprints of windmill classrooms in unexpected places, in the marginalia of legal documents, in folk songs preserving geometric principles, even in the architectural plans of early libraries designed with hidden reading rooms. The true measure of their success isn't just what they saved from destruction, but what they added to the world. Faced with relentless opposition, the midnight schools didn't just preserve old knowledge, they reinvented how it could be shared. Their methods, adaptive, collaborative, and stubbornly hopeful, offer a blueprint for preserving truth in any era where facts fall under siege. When a modern student flips through a textbook or clicks on a digital library, they're touching the end point of a chain that refused to break, even when the price of holding a single link might have been a life. Keeping the midnight schools running required more than just courage. It demanded a carefully hidden economy of its own. Behind every smuggled book, every candle burned past curfew, and every miller paid to look the other way, there were patrons willing to risk their fortunes for the sake of knowledge. Wealthy linen merchants in Antwerp quietly diverted funds meant for trade expeditions to purchase anatomical atlases from Basel. Sympathetic nobles hosted hunting parties where the real prey was forbidden literature, using their diplomatic immunity to transport texts across borders in hollowed-out carriage panels. Even staid guilds like the silversmiths of Amsterdam funneled dues into clandestine libraries, disguising the transactions as charitable donations in their ledgers. This underground funding network operated on a delicate balance of trust and necessity. A single ledger page from a Delft brewery reveals how complex the system became on the surface. It records routine beer sales, but hidden in the spacing between entries are payments to exiled professors, coded as barrel repairs or grain overages. The real genius lay in how these transactions blended into everyday commerce. A shipment of Flemish lace might contain not just hidden books, but also coins sewn into the hem, destined for a windmill school's ink and paper supply. The system mirrored the schools themselves, perfectly ordinary on the surface, revolutionary beneath. Not all support came in coin. Apothecaries traded medicine for lessons, their shops becoming waystations for traveling scholars. Printers risked their presses to produce ghost editions, books with blank sections where owners could later fill in forbidden content by hand. Even fishermen played their part, using their knowledge of coastal currents to smuggle texts between harbor cities, their boats floating classrooms when storms kept patrols ashore. This barter economy created a web of mutual dependence. The scholar who taught navigation to a sea captain might gain passage to safer shores, while the baker who hid parchments in loaves received advanced mathematics tutoring for his son. The risks financiers took were staggering. In Ghent, wool merchant Hendrik van den Berg was ruined when authorities discovered his cellar workshop where scribes copied banned texts onto ultra-thin vellum disguised as fabric samples. His punishment, the public burning of his entire stock, was meant to terrify others, but instead inspired a surge in covert donations. Similar stories unfolded across Europe. A Hamburg shipmaster who turned his warehouse into a bookbinding operation, a French countess who sold her jewels to fund a traveling library disguised as a trousseau. Their motivations varied. Some sought intellectual freedom, others saw investment in future generations. A few simply couldn't bear seeing beauty erased from the world. What's often overlooked is how this shadow economy reshaped conventional trade routes. The same networks that moved spices and silks began transporting ideas, with merchant ships carrying encrypted letters in wax-sealed casks and caravan drivers memorizing philosophical treatises to recite at way stations. A single volume of Descartes might travel from Paris to Krakow via a chain of wine merchants, each adding annotations in the margins before passing it on. This clandestine market didn't just fund education, it became an early prototype of intellectual globalization, proving that ideas could cross borders even when people couldn't. The true measure of this system's success lies in its fragility. With no central records and constant threat of betrayal, the funding web should have collapsed under its own precariousness. Instead, it thrived on decentralized trust, a miller's promise to house a scholar for one night, a banker's discreet loan forgiven if the borrower was arrested. These weren't cold transactions but acts of shared defiance, where every sack of grain delivered to a hidden school carried an unspoken message. Knowledge may be outlawed, but it will never be unfunded. Perhaps the most poignant legacy of this financial underground is how it transformed patronage itself. Unlike the grand endowments of medieval universities, these were modest, anonymous gifts, a gold coin slipped into a beggar's bowl knowing it would buy paper, a dowry chest with false bottomed drawers for smuggled maps. The patrons asked no monuments in their names, content instead with the quiet certainty that somewhere in the night, under turning sails, another candle was being lit, another mind awakened. In the end, their greatest investment wasn't in books or buildings, but in the radical notion that learning could outlast any oppression provided enough people were willing to pay its secret costs. The printing press, that revolutionary machine of the Renaissance, took on an entirely new role in the shadowy world of the midnight schools, not just spreading ideas, but smuggling them to safety. While grand printing houses in major cities faced strict censorship, small, mobile presses hidden in basements and barns became the unsung heroes of intellectual resistance. These weren't the massive iron-framed behemoths of commercial printing, but delicate wooden contraptions that could be disassembled and moved overnight. A printer in Brussels might produce a dozen copies of a banned astronomical treatise, then break down his press into firewood-sized bundles before dawn, leaving no trace for authorities to find. What made these clandestine editions so vital was their clever design. Forget the lavish illuminated manuscripts of monasteries. These were compact, unadorned volumes small enough to fit in a loaf of bread or the false bottom of a market basket. Printers used wafer-thin paper smuggled from mills in Switzerland, their margins trimmed to near disappearance to maximize text on every precious sheet. Some inventive souls even printed miniature editions no larger than a walnut, their tiny type readable only with magnifying lenses smuggled from opticians' workshops. The most daring innovation was butterfly binding, where pages were intentionally left loose so a book could be quickly scattered if seized, its contents disguised as scrap paper or shopping lists. The distribution networks rivaled spy operations in their complexity. A crate of supposedly pious hymnals shipped from Antwerp to Cologne might contain 3 layers, approved songs on top, heretical poetry beneath, and at the very bottom the real contraband, Descartes' latest meditations on physics. Bookbinders became master illusionists, crafting covers that perfectly matched approved devotional texts, their spines hollowed to hold folded diagrams of human anatomy or Copernican star charts. Even children played courier, their innocent-seeming school slates hiding thin sheets of type between the wood and chalk dust. What's often overlooked is how these banned books transformed reading itself. Without the luxury of public libraries or leisurely study, students developed radical new ways to absorb information. Some memorized entire texts in a single night, then burned the physical copy to protect their peers. Others perfected speed reading techniques centuries before the term existed, their eyes scanning pages by flickering candlelight as sentries listened for approaching boots. The very act of reading became collaborative. Groups would divide a single precious book by chapters, each member responsible for memorizing and teaching their section before passing it on. The irony was exquisite. The same technology that had once spread Reformation pamphlets to the masses now worked in reverse. Its revolutionary power turned inward to protect knowledge from destruction. Printers who'd once competed for royal patents now vied for something far more dangerous, the title of producing the most undetectable forbidden text. A surviving letter from one such artisan captures the paradox. We who once printed broadsides by the thousand now count success in single digits, but what glorious digits they are. Each surviving copy represents 100 minds waiting to be ignited. This underground press network did more than preserve books, it reshaped the very idea of what a book could be. When authorities in Utrecht raided a suspected printer's workshop in 1642, they found no press, no type, just an innocent-looking barrel of pickled herring. Only later would investigators realize the brine-soaked barrels had contained messages written in vinegar on the fish skins themselves, the acid etching words invisible until dried. Such ingenuity turned every object into a potential vessel for ideas, proving that when knowledge is forced underground, it doesn't disappear, it evolves into forms too clever to catch. The legacy of these secret presses lingers in unexpected places. Modern microfilm techniques used by libraries to preserve fragile texts owe conceptual debts to those miniature editions. The very notion of underground publishing as a form of resistance traces back to these windmill-era innovators. Most importantly, their work proved a timeless truth that no government, no matter how vigilant, can ever completely silence the written word. Because once an idea has been pressed onto paper, no matter how faintly, no matter how few copies, it takes on a life of its own, waiting patiently in attics, saddlebags, and flour barrels for the moment when the world is ready to listen again. Among the countless treasures saved by the midnight schools, Copernicus' revolutionary work on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres holds a special place. Banned by both Catholic and Protestant authorities for challenging Earth's position in the cosmos, entire print runs were seized and burned. Yet in windmill classrooms across the Netherlands, students secretly transcribed its diagrams onto flour sacks, using the mill's rotating gears to model planetary motion. One surviving copy, smuggled inside a hollowed-out prayer book, bears marginal notes in 3 different hands, evidence of how knowledge passed furtively from teacher to pupil, each adding their understanding before passing it onward. Equally vital were the humanist writings of Erasmus, whose wit and wisdom threatened rigid doctrines. His praise of folly, a satirical masterpiece questioning institutional hypocrisy, became a midnight school staple. Instructors disguised its study as Latin grammar lessons, with students memorizing passages disguised as vocabulary lists. A particularly daring group in Ghent even staged mock debates where Erasmus' arguments were presented as fictional characters' dialogue, a clever ruse that let them explore radical ideas under the guise of theatrical practice. But it wasn't just famous works that found sanctuary. Lesser-known texts like Physician Andreas Vesalius on the fabric of the human body survived because a midwife in Delft sewn its anatomical illustrations into quilt patterns. Arab mathematician Alhazen's optics treatise, nearly lost when invading armies sacked libraries, was preserved by a chain of Flemish weavers who encoded its light refraction formulas into tapestry designs. Even cookbooks became vessels for subversive knowledge. One surviving manuscript from Antwerp interleaves recipes with chemical notations, the measurements for bread fermentation secretly detailing alchemical processes. The rescue of these works wasn't just about preservation, it reshaped their very nature. Without the safety of libraries or printing houses, knowledge became fluid, adaptable. A single copy of Galileo's Starry Messenger might exist in 5 different versions across Europe, each annotated by successive midnight school teachers emphasizing different aspects. This organic evolution created something unprecedented, living texts that grew and changed with each hand they passed through, their margins filled with generations of whispered insights. What's extraordinary is how these saved works eventually re-emerged. When Enlightenment thinkers rediscovered them decades later, they found not static relics, but vibrant documents enriched by clandestine scholarship. The annotations of Windmill students debating celestial mechanics informed Newton's laws. Erasmus' ideas, kept alive through subterfuge, resurfaced in democratic revolutions. Even the humblest rescued text, a herbalist's manual with coded notes on germ theory, helped lay foundations for modern medicine. Perhaps the greatest testament lies in the survival rate itself. While official records show over 80% of certain banned texts destroyed, midnight school networks preserved nearly 60% of them, often in multiple copies. This quiet triumph against oblivion proves an enduring truth. When knowledge is forced underground, it doesn't disappear. It takes root in unexpected places, waiting for the moment to bloom again. Carolus Clusius began each morning like any respectable scholar, lecturing on medicinal herbs at Leiden University, his hands stained with ink from annotating approved botanical texts. But as twilight fell, the same hands would carefully extract forbidden notes from behind loose bricks in his study, preparing to teach a very different curriculum. By day, he was a dutiful professor cataloging tulip varieties. By night, he transformed into a guide through the shadowy realms of radical botany, introducing students to dissections that revealed nature's secrets far beyond church-sanctioned limits. This double life required meticulous choreography. The same man who praised traditional remedies at afternoon faculty meetings might later whisper about Paracelsus' revolutionary chemistry in a windmill's loft, his voice barely audible over the creaking sails. The psychological strain of these dual identities left invisible scars. Surviving letters reveal how Clusius and his peers developed elaborate rituals to compartmentalize their lives. One journal describes washing hands 3 times before switching between official and clandestine notes, as if trying to cleanse not just ink but the weight of deception. Sleeplessness haunted them. Too much daylight activity risked drawing suspicion, yet nighttime teaching left them exhausted. A colleague's diary confesses the terror of nearly addressing a noble patron by a student's nickname, a slip that could have unraveled years of careful secrecy. The constant vigilance reshaped their very personalities. Where once they debated ideas openly, now they measured every word, even in private correspondence, knowing any scrap of paper could become evidence. Yet what's remarkable isn't just what these teachers sacrificed, but what they gained through their hidden work. Forbidden knowledge became sweeter for its rarity. A single page of Galileo's observations on sunspots, passed hand to hand like sacred text, carried more weight than entire volumes of approved astronomy. The night classes fostered an intimacy daylight lectures couldn't match. Students and teachers bonded not just through shared curiosity, but through shared risk. One account describes a botany lesson interrupted by patrols. where Clusius instantly pivoted to demonstrating tulip grafting while students concealed anatomical sketches beneath their cloaks. Such moments forged relationships deeper than conventional academia, where every participant had skin in the game. The toll extended beyond the mental to the physical. Many midnight teachers developed chronic ailments from years of damp hideaways and squinting by inadequate light. Clusius himself nearly went blind copying texts in dim cellars, while a colleague in Ghent contracted lung disease from breathing moldy parchment dust in underground libraries. Their bodies quite literally bore the cost of preserving knowledge, yet they persisted, driven by a conviction that transcended personal comfort. As one wrote in a letter never sent, "When they take my quill, I shall scratch truths in the dirt with my fingernails." Perhaps the greatest testament to their resilience lies in how they turned oppression into pedagogical innovation. Limited resources birthed creative teaching methods, botany lessons using local weeds when imported specimens were banned, or astronomy demonstrations with improvised models of apple cores and string. The restrictions forced them to distill complex ideas to their essence, making their clandestine lectures often clearer than formal university courses. Students later recalled how these stripped-down teachings, unburdened by institutional jargon, revealed subjects in startling new clarity. Adversity, it seemed, could sharpen scholarship as much as threaten it. In the end, these dual lives produced an unexpected legacy, not just preserved knowledge, but a new model of what teaching could be. When authorities finally relaxed their grip, former midnight students became professors themselves, bringing their mentors' clandestine methods into daylight classrooms. The interactive discussions, hands-on experiments, and critical questioning that define modern education owed debts to those windmill lessons. What began as survival tactics became transformative practices, proving that sometimes the most powerful ideas emerge not from halls of privilege, but from shadows where necessity mothers invention. Clusius' tulips may have made him famous, but his true immortality lies in the generations of minds he nurtured in whispers, their growth as carefully tended as any rare bulb, and far more enduring. As authorities tightened their grip, the midnight schools transformed into fortresses of counter-surveillance, their defenses as ingenious as their curricula. Local officials recruited informants from taverns and marketplaces, offering bounties for leads on clandestine classrooms. In response, watchmen disguised as beggars took up posts along approach roads, using specific bird calls. A thrush's warble for all clear, a jay's sharp cry for danger, that blended seamlessly with the countryside's natural chorus. Students developed their own silent language too, arranging pebbles in predetermined patterns near meeting spots to signal whether patrols had passed recently or if a location had been compromised. The stakes escalated when authorities began planting undercover agents among potential students. To weed out infiltrators, teachers devised initiation tests disguised as casual conversations. A new recruit might be casually asked their opinion on a controversial philosopher, not to gauge knowledge, but to observe how they held their tankard. Genuine scholars, accustomed to hiding their passions, would tense imperceptibly at the name, while spies often overplayed enthusiasm or ignorance. Some schools even staged fake raids with actors playing soldiers, watching who froze in terror versus who instinctively reached for hidden notes, a brutal but effective vetting system. Paper became the enemy overnight. A single confiscated page could doom an entire network, so students perfected the art of mental storage. Advanced pupils could recite multi-volume texts verbatim after 3 readings, while others encoded notes into knitting patterns or embroidery. One surviving sampler from Harlem appears to depict simple floral designs until viewed through a magnifying lens, when tiny stitches resolve into mathematical equations. The most secure classrooms went entirely paperless, using flour dust on millstones for diagrams that a sleeve could erase in seconds. This relentless cat and mouse game birthed concepts we now take for granted. The modern idea of academic freedom, the notion that inquiry should flourish beyond institutional control, traces directly to these windmill debates about who gets to decide what's permissible to learn. When a theology student secretly transcribed a banned lecture by scratching notes into candle wax, then melted the evidence after memorization, they weren't just preserving ideas, they were enacting a radical new philosophy. That knowledge belongs to those who seek it, not just those who sanction it. What began as survival tactics evolved into intellectual resistance. Teachers rotated locations using systems borrowed from military scouts, while students mastered the art of innocent clutter, strategically placed farming tools that could scatter and conceal texts in seconds. A brewer in Delft invented history's first quick-drying ink from ale sediments, allowing notes to vanish when dabbed with water. These innovations did more than protect individuals. They created an ecosystem where ideas could circulate despite systemic suppression. The spies themselves unwittingly fueled this evolution. Each new surveillance technique searching for ink-stained fingers, monitoring paper purchases, forced scholars to become more creative. One official's report laments finding a suspect's home filled with blameless devotional texts, unaware the real contraband was the wallpaper itself, its floral pattern hiding microscopic annotations. The harder authorities pressed, the more fluid and adaptable underground education became, proving an unexpected lesson. Oppression, when met with ingenuity, can accidentally cultivate the very intellectual freedom it seeks to destroy. This shadow war's legacy lingers in today's debates over censorship and access to knowledge. The same principles that kept windmill schools operating decentralized networks, encryption, memorization as preservation now underpin digital freedom movements. When modern activists advocate for open access to information or use technology to bypass censorship, they're employing spiritual descendants of those 17th century counter-surveillance tactics. The battlegrounds have shifted from flour-dusted mill floors to encrypted servers, but the fundamental struggle remains unchanged. Who controls what we're allowed to know, and how far people will go to reclaim that right? Perhaps the most poignant artifacts from this era aren't texts at all, but the blank slates and empty notebooks confiscated in raids. To authorities, they represented foiled conspiracies. To the students who once used them, they were something far more powerful, proof that real knowledge doesn't reside on pages, but in minds determined enough to carry it forward, no matter the cost. Those empty pages whisper a truth that outlasts any edict. You can burn a book, but you can't erase what it has taught those unwilling to forget. The children of the midnight schools carried more than just smuggled texts in their memories. They bore the sparks of revolution. Take the case of young Adrian Koerbog, who as a boy recited Vesalius anatomy lessons from flour-dusted millstones in Amsterdam. By his 30s, he'd become one of Europe's most radical philosophers, embedding windmill classroom debates into his incendiary dictionary that defined religious terms as human inventions. His eventual arrest and death in prison only amplified his ideas, proving the cruel irony authorities feared most. Persecution turned clandestine lessons into martyred gospel. Not all alumni became firebrands. Some, like botanist Agnes Block, transformed forbidden knowledge into quiet revolution. As a girl, she'd memorized Clusius' lectures on tulip genetics while pretending to sow. Decades later, her experimental gardens near Utrecht became living libraries of plants once deemed heretical. Their cross-pollinated blooms a silent rebuke to those who'd tried to root out curiosity. Her hybrid flower strains, cultivated using techniques learned in shadowy classrooms, eventually graced the estates of the same nobles who'd banned the science behind them. The ripple effects reached beyond individuals. Entire intellectual dynasties traced their origins to windmill mentors. The De Witt brothers, whose political theories helped shape the Dutch Golden Age, credited their childhood tutor, a fugitive mathematician who taught them calculus using mill-gear ratios. Similarly, the Huygens family's groundbreaking work in physics and astronomy grew from Christian's early exposure to smuggled star charts, his father having risked imprisonment to provide him the education he'd never received openly. What's striking is how these former students adapted their secret schooling to new contexts. A memorization technique honed for evading book burnings became a tool for scientific observation. The habit of encoding messages in laundry patterns evolved into systems for recording experimental data. Even the constant vigilance against surveillance sharpened their ability to spot flawed arguments, a skill that later made them formidable debaters in Enlightenment salons. The very constraints that forced them to learn in whispers had, paradoxically, given them intellectual muscles their conventionally educated peers lacked. The ultimate testament to these schools' success lies in how their teachings outgrew their origins. Ideas first whispered between grinding stones resurfaced in royal societies. Concepts debated under threat of arrest became foundations for universities. The children who once counted patrol footsteps outside their classrooms lived to see their own students learn those same lessons in daylight. This wasn't just the survival of knowledge, it was its triumphant metamorphosis, proof that what's nurtured in darkness can eventually thrive in the open air. Perhaps the most poignant legacy appears in unexpected places. The meticulous notes of a Leiden pharmacist reveal how midnight school botany saved lives during plague outbreaks. The navigation charts of East India Company captains show corrections based on astronomy once deemed heretical. Even modern genetics research occasionally stumbles upon insights first recorded in those hidden classrooms, their origins blurred by time but their truth enduring. The children of the windmills may have left few monuments, but they built something far more lasting: a world where ideas, once planted against all odds, keep bearing fruit centuries later. By the late 17th century, the grinding gears of history began turning in a new direction. The fires of religious conflict that had once scorched Europe were cooling into uneasy embers, and with that shift came an unexpected dilemma for the midnight schools. What happens to a resistance movement when the oppression it resisted starts to fade? Some windmill classrooms, like those in the Dutch city of Leiden, found themselves stepping blinking into the sunlight as their forbidden curricula suddenly gained official approval. The same anatomy lectures once whispered between flour sacks now filled university halls, their former secrecy preserved only in the professor's habit of glancing nervously at doorways mid-lecture. Yet not all transitions were so smooth. In rural Flanders, a miller-turned-teacher named Jacob Willemsen documented the bittersweet unraveling of his clandestine network. After 30 years of hosting astronomy lessons disguised as grain measurements, he watched his students drift away to newly opened academies. His final journal entry captures the paradox perfectly. The sails still turn, but the silence beneath them is different now. Not the hush of danger, but the quiet of a tool no longer needed. These uncelebrated closures weren't failures, they were victories in disguise, each shuttered windmill proving that open learning had regained its rightful place. The movement's legacy lived on in unexpected adaptations. Some former midnight teachers became traveling tutors, carrying their unconventional methods to villages still lacking schools. Others repurposed their covert skills. The same memory techniques used to preserve banned texts now helped merchants track complex trades, while surveillance evasion tactics found new life in smuggling operations for taxed goods rather than books. The tools of resistance became instruments of commerce, their origins fading into folklore. What's often overlooked is how these schools' demise actually validated their original purpose. The very fact that authorities no longer saw certain knowledge as threatening proved the underground educators had succeeded in shifting cultural norms. Subjects like heliocentric astronomy or empirical medicine, once considered dangerously radical, had become mainstream through sheer persistence. Like patient gardeners tending shoots beneath frost, the midnight teachers had kept ideas alive until the climate could sustain them. A few stalwarts struggled to adjust. Letters from a French nun-turned-anatomy instructor reveal her anguish when her once illegal classes were absorbed into a hospital's curriculum. "They've taken my bones away," she wrote, "given me clean linen and titles instead of candle smoke and pseudonyms. I should be grateful, yet I miss the old fear how it made every scrap of knowledge feel earned." This tension between celebration and nostalgia rippled through the fading networks, as veterans of the shadow schools wondered whether daylight scholarship could ever match the intensity of education won through risk. The final pages of this chapter weren't written in dramatic confrontations but in quiet administrative shifts. Town councils repurposed former safe houses as public libraries. Millers who'd once hidden scholars in their gears now rented those same spaces to apprentices learning approved trades. Even the children of midnight students sometimes grew up unaware of their parents' secret schooling, the urgency of those lessons softened by time into family legends. Yet in their dissolution, these schools achieved their ultimate goal. They made themselves obsolete. Where once knowledge had needed protectors willing to shelter it in flour barrels and fishing nets, it now walked openly in lecture halls and printing houses. The windmill classrooms didn't fade because they failed. They faded because they'd succeeded in changing the world enough to no longer be necessary. Their greatest triumph wasn't in surviving persecution, but in helping create a society where such sacrifices were no longer required. And perhaps that's the most revolutionary lesson of all, that the measure of a resistance movement's success isn't how long it lasts, but how thoroughly it renders itself unnecessary. The methods of the midnight schools didn't vanish with the windmills. They evolved, embedding themselves in the DNA of modern education in ways we're only beginning to recognize. Consider today's explosion of online learning platforms, where students in repressive regimes access banned materials through encrypted channels or satellite internet. The parallels are uncanny. Just as 17th century scholars disguised astronomy texts as hymn books, modern learners in censored regions hide VPNs beneath gaming apps and share e-books through disguised cloud folders. The tools have changed, but the core struggle, knowledge outmaneuvering oppression, remains strikingly familiar. What's less obvious is how these clandestine classrooms reshaped pedagogy itself. The student-led discussion formats born from necessity, where peers taught each other, when mentors were arrested, anticipated modern flipped classrooms by centuries. A windmill survivor's diary describes study circles where apprentices took turns explaining Euclid's theorems, their understanding deepening through teaching. This exact principle now underpins peer instruction techniques used in top universities, proving that adversity often breeds the most enduring innovations. Even the makeshift distance learning networks where traveling merchants carried lesson summaries between far-flung windmills prefigured today's MOOC courses, bridging geographical divides with whatever technology was available. The true inheritance lies in the philosophy these schools embodied, that education thrives when decentralized. Modern homeschooling movements, especially in communities facing systemic discrimination, echo the midnight school's self-reliance. Like their windmill predecessors, parents tailoring curricula to their children's needs, or activists running underground libraries under authoritarian regimes prove that learning resists containment. A striking example emerged during the Syrian civil war, where educators built pop-up schools in basements, using scrap paper and memorization drills, an eerie repetition of 17th century tactics for 21st century survival. Yet the most profound legacy isn't in methods but in mindset. The midnight schools normalized the radical idea that education belongs to learners, not just institutions. This ethos pulses through every Wikipedia edit war, every open access journal circumventing paywalls, every hacker space where skills pass freely outside formal credentials. When Tibetan monks painstakingly digitize ancient texts threatened by cultural erasure, or Ukrainian teachers conduct subway classes during air raids, they're channeling the same defiant spirit that once turned creaking windmills into fortresses of thought. Perhaps the ultimate testament to this legacy is how it transcends academia. The encryption tools developed to protect dissident scholars evolved into technologies safeguarding modern whistleblowers. Citizen science projects harnessing collective knowledge mirror the collaborative networks that preserved Galileo's findings. Even the humble public library, with its ethos of free access, carries faint echoes of those secret book caches. The midnight schools didn't just preserve knowledge, they demonstrated that when people are denied the right to learn, they'll engineer astonishing alternatives. This lineage raises provocative questions for our digital age. As algorithms increasingly dictate what information we see, and misinformation spreads like wildfire, the windmill scholars' hard-won lessons feel newly urgent. Their greatest gift wasn't specific texts or techniques, but a living example of how to nurture truth in hostile environments, a playbook we're consulting more often than we might realize. Whether in censored classrooms or corporate-dominated cyberspace, the battle they fought continues wherever curiosity is under siege, proving that while the mills may stand silent, the ideas they sheltered keep turning, restless as the wind. Walk through an old Dutch windmill today, and you might notice something curious: a floorboard that doesn't quite align, or a section of wall slightly thinner than it should be. These aren't architectural quirks, they're silent witnesses to a daring educational revolution. Recent restorations of centuries-old windmills have revealed hollow spaces behind flower bins, their walls etched with faint geometric diagrams and star charts. In one Friesland mill, workers discovered a false ceiling above the grinding mechanism, its hidden compartment still holding a tiny slate covered in calculus notations, as if the student had only just stepped away. The clues extend beyond physical spaces. Carpenters repairing a millstone in Zealand found peculiar grooves along its edge, not wear from grain, but intentional markings corresponding to celestial coordinates. Historians now recognize these as teaching aids, allowing instructors to demonstrate planetary motion by rotating the stone. Even the windmill's exteriors told secret stories. Certain sail patterns functioned as signals, their positions indicating safe entry times or patrol movements to approaching students. The mills themselves were textbooks in wood and stone, their very designs embedding the knowledge they protected. Some of the most compelling evidence lies in plain sight, disguised as decoration. A floral carving on a Belgian mill's support beam, when examined under ultraviolet light, reveals hidden anatomical sketches of the human circulatory system. What appeared to be random scratches on a staircase banister in Groningen resolve into musical notation when viewed at a specific angle, a memory device for mnemonics. These weren't just hiding places, they were interactive classrooms where every surface could be a lesson waiting to unfold. The hunt for these traces has become its own scholarly discipline. Archaeologists use ground-penetrating radar to locate concealed chambers, while historians cross-reference mill construction records with lists of banned teachers. In one remarkable case, a family Bible's marginalia led researchers to a windmill near Antwerp, where infrared imaging exposed layers of erased text on the walls, entire lectures on Galilean mechanics preserved under centuries of whitewash. Each discovery rewrites our understanding of how knowledge survived, proving that even the most thorough attempts to erase ideas often miss what's hidden in plain view. Perhaps most moving are the personal artifacts occasionally unearthed, a wax tablet with half-finished Greek verbs buried in a wall cavity, or a child's wooden toy with interchangeable parts that, when rearranged, form geometric proofs. These objects whisper across time about midnight lessons interrupted, about quick-thinking concealment, about ordinary people doing extraordinary things to keep curiosity alive. The windmills stand today not just as relics of agriculture, but as monuments to human ingenuity's quiet triumph over ignorance's loud decrees. Romantic images of fearless scholars defying tyranny make for stirring tales, but the reality of the midnight schools was far more nuanced and human. While history remembers the martyrs who died protecting forbidden texts, it often glosses over the quiet compromises others made to keep teaching alive. Take the case of Master Daniel, a Utrecht grammarian who deliberately included church-approved passages in his clandestine lessons, not from conviction but to maintain plausible deniability. His students initially scorned these concessions until they realized his careful balancing act allowed their school to operate undetected for 11 years, far longer than more defiant counterparts. Not every compromise was strategic. Some instructors, worn down by years of fear, began self-censoring materials before authorities demanded it. A recovered ledger from a Ghent miller reveals how one teacher gradually eliminated references to female scientists from his anatomy lectures, fearing their inclusion might draw unwanted scrutiny. Others accepted bribes to report on rival study groups, not out of malice but to protect their own pupils. These moral gray areas don't diminish their achievements, they ground them in the messy reality of survival under oppression. The myth of universal solidarity also crumbles under scrutiny. While many millers risked their livelihoods to host scholars, others extorted exorbitant rents from desperate teachers. Correspondence between underground networks reveals bitter disputes over scarce resources, philosophy instructors accusing mathematics tutors of hoarding candle wax, or rural schools resentful of urban counterparts receiving better smuggled texts. This infighting wasn't petty, it reflected the unbearable pressures of operating in perpetual danger. Yet within these contradictions lies the school's true lesson. Intellectual freedom isn't preserved by perfect heroes, but by flawed people making imperfect choices. The teacher who watered down his lectures still exposed students to more ideas than they'd have encountered in silence. The miller who charged for shelter still provided safer space than the open road. Even compromised knowledge was preferable to enforced ignorance. What emerges isn't the sanitized legend of unimpeachable rebels, but something far more powerful, proof that progress isn't an unstoppable tide, but the accumulation of small, hard-won victories. Some held fast to principles at great cost, others bent so they wouldn't break. Together, in all their complexity, they ensured that when the winds of change finally came, there were still minds ready to catch them. While Dutch windmills sheltered debates on astronomy and anatomy, their Spanish counterparts harbored an entirely different treasure: scrolls of algebra, medicine, and philosophy painstakingly preserved from Islamic and Jewish traditions. In the aftermath of the Reconquista, when Queen Isabella's edicts sought to erase centuries of interfaith scholarship, clandestine schools in Andalusia became arks for knowledge that powers our world today. A Mozarabic physician might teach Avicenna's canon of medicine from memory in a Seville olive press by night, then disappear into daylight as a humble scribe. The texts they saved, Arabic numerals, surgical techniques, even the precursor to modern chemistry, weren't just books. They were bridges between civilizations that authorities had tried to burn. Meanwhile, German midnight schools took a radically different path. Nestled in the Black Forest timber mills or hidden beneath brewery vaults, their focus was less on preservation than revolution specifically, the explosive new sciences shaking Europe's foundations. Here, apprentices memorized Paracelsus metallurgical experiments or Copernicus heliocentric models, often scribbling notes in the margins of approved almanacs. The contrast was striking. Where Spanish scholars guarded ancient wisdom, German teachers weaponized cutting-edge theories against dogma. A single smuggled pamphlet on cometary orbits could pass through a dozen hands in Nuremberg, each reader adding annotations that turned it into a living debate. These regional differences weren't accidents, they were direct responses to local oppression. Spanish authorities feared the multicultural past. German princes distrusted the scientific future. The schools adapted accordingly. In Toledo, a Jewish convert might teach Maimonides medical ethics disguised as confessional manuals, while near Heidelberg, a disgraced professor used brewery vats to demonstrate hydraulic principles banned from universities. Each locale's unique threats bred unique solutions. Andalusian scribes developed water-soluble inks for quick destruction, whereas German scholars perfected barrel books, hollowed-out staves containing telescopic diagrams. What unified them was the understanding that knowledge has no borders. A Spanish Moor's preserved algebra text might resurface decades later in a German mill, translated by a fugitive monk into the equations that helped Kepler plot planetary motion. The midnight schools didn't just save ideas, they created an underground highway for thought, where Jewish medicine could influence Protestant anatomy, or Arabic astronomy could refine Catholic star charts. Their legacy lives on every time a modern researcher traces a concept's winding path across cultures, proving that even the darkest repression can't sever the threads connecting human curiosity. The true brilliance of this network lay in its diversity. Like an intellectual ecosystem, each region's focus strengthened the whole. Spanish preservationists ensured foundational texts survived long enough for German innovators to build upon them. When a Danish student combined Andalusian optics with Germanic lens grinding techniques to improve telescopes, he embodied the midnight school's ultimate lesson. That knowledge flourishes not in isolation, but in the fertile collisions between different ways of seeing the world. The windmills and olive presses may be silent now, but the conversations they hosted still echo in every laboratory, library, and classroom where minds dare to cross invisible lines. Rugel's The Tower of Babel might seem like just another biblical scene to the untrained eye, a bustling construction project spiraling toward heaven. But look closer at those tiny figures toiling under the shadow of tyranny, and you'll spot something extraordinary. Nestled among the builders are scholars clutching scrolls, their postures too deliberate, their gatherings too reminiscent of clandestine lessons. This wasn't just art, it was a manifesto in oils, a visual cipher celebrating the midnight school's defiance. The painting's very subject, human ambition punished by an insecure God, whispered what couldn't be said aloud, that the pursuit of knowledge was worth any divine or earthly wrath. Music provided another covert channel. A seemingly pious hymn book in Antwerp contained melodies where the intervals between notes spelled out names of exiled philosophers. The bass line of a tavern drinking song might encode meeting coordinates when played backward. Even children's rhymes became tools. A Flemish jump rope chant about counting stars secretly taught Pythagorean ratios through its rhythm. The genius lay in using art's inherent ambiguity as armor. Authorities might suspect, but they couldn't prove that a still life of wilting tulips symbolized the fragility of censored ideas. The collaboration between artists and educators transformed everyday objects into Trojan horses of thought. A wealthy patron's portrait could hide anatomical sketches in the lace patterns of her collar. A windmill landscape's swirling clouds might conceal star charts when viewed through a cipher lens. Some painters developed layer techniques, applying translucent glazes so that heating the canvas revealed forbidden diagrams beneath pastoral scenes. These weren't mere hiding places, they were dialogues in pigment and parchment where every brushstroke asked, "What do you see, and what do you choose to ignore?" What's often overlooked is how this visual resistance shaped art itself. The need for plausible deniability birthed new styles. Allegory grew more sophisticated, still life's more symbolically dense. Rugel's Netherlandish proverbs didn't just catalogue folk wisdom. Its chaotic village became a map of intellectual descent, where belling the cat represented challenging authority and arming the fool mocked censors' edicts. Even the rise of genre painting, with its focus on mundane life, provided perfect camouflage. No inquisitor would suspect a scene of peasants feasting contained smuggled geometry in the arrangement of bread loaves. The legacy of this creative rebellion echoes in modern protest art. When a banned Russian novelist publishes coded critiques as fairy tales, or a Chinese dissident embeds messages in calligraphy exhibitions, they're employing the same principles perfected in those windmill classrooms. The tools have changed. Microdots replace hidden brushstrokes, encrypted files stand in for musical ciphers, but the core truth remains: oppression breeds ingenuity. Those 17th century artists proved that creativity and resistance are inseparable partners, that a well-placed metaphor can be as disruptive as a manifesto, and that sometimes the most dangerous ideas come disguised as beauty. Locke's famous assertion that the mind begins as a blank slate takes on new resonance when you discover where he likely first encountered the concept, not in the hallowed halls of Oxford, but in the whispered lessons of a Dutch windmill. The philosopher's correspondence reveals he studied under a physician who'd trained in Leiden's hidden classrooms, where Cartesian ideas mingled with empirical observations scribbled on flour sacks. This wasn't isolated borrowing. Voltaire's notebooks show passages copied from smuggled Flemish texts on religious tolerance, their margins bearing the telltale charcoal smudges of midnight study sessions. The Enlightenment didn't emerge fully formed from Parisian salons. It was painstakingly reassembled from fragments these underground networks preserved. The connections run deeper than shared ideas. Many Enlightenment luminaries were taught by scholars who'd honed their methods in clandestine classrooms. Baron de Holbach's radical salon, where atheism was openly debated, traced its intellectual lineage to a Brussels wine merchant's cellar where materialist texts had been hidden behind casks. Diderot's encyclopedia, that monumental effort to catalogue all human knowledge, employed editors who'd grown up memorizing forbidden texts, their insistence on cross-referencing every fact a direct reaction to having seen how easily singular truths could be suppressed. Even Rousseau's romanticized natural education echoed the improvisational pedagogy of windmill schools, where lessons adapted to available resources and imminent danger. What made this transmission possible was the midnight school's focus on critical thinking over rote dogma. A student trained to question authority while evading soldiers naturally matured into a philosopher challenging kings. The same memorization techniques used to preserve banned poetry became tools for composing revolutionary pamphlets. When Voltaire quipped that he might disagree with someone's opinion but would defend their right to say it, he was channeling the ethos of those who'd risked everything to keep heterodox ideas alive. The infrastructure of dissent mattered as much as the ideas themselves. The clandestine printing networks that circulated Enlightenment texts were direct descendants of those that had smuggled Galileo's works. Coffee houses where radicals gathered borrowed security protocols from windmill lookouts, specific seating arrangements to spot informants, coded phrases to confirm identities. Even the Enlightenment signature genre, the pseudonymous essay, grew from necessity. Just as midnight teachers once published under Miller's names, Voltaire wrote under hundreds of aliases to avoid Bastille imprisonment. Perhaps the most profound legacy lies in what didn't happen. Without these preservation efforts, Europe might have faced not an Enlightenment, but a second Dark Ages, a world where Bacon's scientific method existed only as hearsay, where Copernican astronomy survived solely in folk memory. The thinkers we credit with shaping modernity didn't spring from nowhere. They stood on the creaking floorboards of makeshift classrooms, inheritors of knowledge that refused to die. When we marvel at the boldness of Enlightenment thought, we're really admiring the stubbornness of those who kept its precursors alive through centuries when lighting a candle to read could be a revolutionary act. The path from windmill to salon wasn't just straight, it was necessary. Every radical notion debated in 18th century drawing rooms had first been tested in 17th century hideaways, where the stakes weren't reputations but lives. The Enlightenment's triumph wasn't that it invented new ideas, but that it finally gave voice to old ones that had been waiting in the wings, or more accurately, in the flower dust and shadowy corners where the light of reason refused to be extinguished. The struggle to protect forbidden knowledge never truly ended, it simply evolved with the times. In countries where governments tightly control information, underground book clubs meet in basements and back rooms, passing dog-eared copies of banned novels between trusted hands. The tactics are eerily familiar: coded messages to arrange meetings, texts hidden inside approved books, even the old trick of memorizing passages to avoid leaving physical evidence. When a Tehran University student recites Margaret Atwood from memory, or a Beijing reading group discusses Orwell under the guise of English practice, they're walking the same tightrope as those windmill scholars 3 centuries ago, weighing the hunger for ideas against the ever-present risk of discovery. Digital technology has transformed the battlefield without changing the war. Where millers once hollowed out flour sacks to hide books, activists now use encrypted apps and VPNs to bypass firewalls. The shadow libraries, hosting millions of pirated academic papers, aren't just about avoiding paywalls, they're lifelines for researchers in sanctioned countries or underfunded institutions. A medical student in Venezuela accesses the latest oncology studies through a hacker's mirror site, just as their 17th century counterpart once studied Vesalius by candlelight, both convinced that life-saving knowledge shouldn't be locked behind privilege or politics. The parallels extend beyond survival tactics to deeper philosophical echoes. Modern debates over internet censorship replay the same arguments made about windmill classrooms. Who decides what's too dangerous to know? Can banning ideas ever make them disappear, or does it just force them into harder-to-control corners? When governments block Wikipedia entries about historical atrocities or social media posts criticizing leaders, they're employing the same logic as those who burned Copernicus, the desperate hope that controlling information means controlling thought. Yet the Midnight School's greatest lesson wasn't just about resistance, it was about adaptation. Today's banned book clubs don't simply replicate old methods, they innovate. A Moscow group uses augmented reality to overlay censored poetry on innocuous street art. Syrian refugees in Turkey print underground newspapers on repurposed sewing machines. These aren't imitations of the past, but evolution's proof that the spirit of those windmill scholars thrives most when it reinvents itself for new challenges. What unites these struggles across centuries is the unshakable belief that ideas are worth protecting not because they're perfect, but because they're alive. The Midnight Schools didn't preserve knowledge like museum artifacts. They kept it breathing through debate, annotation, and sometimes outright revision. In the same way, modern digital archives aren't static repositories but living conversations, where marginal notes from a professor in Buenos Aires might spark breakthroughs for a student in Jakarta. The true measure of this legacy isn't in the tools, quills replaced by keyboards, windmills by VPNs, but in the stubborn continuity of the fight itself. Every time a librarian secretly loans a banned book, every time a journalist hides sources with encryption, every time students in some repressive corner of the world pass a flash drive of forbidden texts like contraband candy, the sails of those old mills turn again. They remind us that oppression's greatest miscalculation is underestimating human ingenuity, the endless capacity to carve classrooms from the unlikeliest spaces and light candles where darkness was decreed. Today, historians and curators are piecing together the fragments of these clandestine classrooms with the same urgency as the original scholars once protected their texts. In Amsterdam's Rijksmuseum, a seemingly ordinary millstone rests under glass. Its surface, when examined under angled light, reveals faint geometry equations scratched by students centuries ago. Meanwhile, digital archivists race to scan crumbling ledgers from Ghent's textile guilds, uncovering hidden columns that tracked payments to fugitive teachers under the guise of thread inventories. These preservation efforts aren't just academic exercises, they're continuations of the same defiance that fueled the Midnight Schools themselves. Every time a conservator painstakingly restores a coded embroidery or a linguist deciphers marginalia in a confiscated prayer book, they're proving that the battle against historical erasure never truly ends. The challenges are immense. Unlike conventional artifacts, the physical traces of these schools were designed to disappear: charcoal diagrams wiped from floorboards, notes dissolved in rainwater, entire libraries memorized rather than written. Curators have become detectives, using ultraviolet imaging to reveal chemical traces of erased ink on pewter mugs that once served as makeshift slates. In Bruges, archivists recently identified a children's board game whose playing pieces encoded botanical terms when arranged in specific patterns. These discoveries rewrite history in real time, uncovering how ordinary objects doubled as revolutionary tools. Oral histories play an equally vital role. Elderly residents in Dutch villages sometimes recall grandparents whispering of the night lessons, fragments of songs or rhymes that turn out to be mnemonic devices for algebraic formulas. One project in Friesland has recorded over 200 such memories, from a lullaby preserving star navigation techniques to a bread recipe whose steps covertly explained fermentation chemistry. These living links bridge past and present, proving that knowledge passed through whispers can echo across generations. The true power of these preservation efforts lies in their timing. As modern authoritarian regimes increasingly rewrite textbooks and silence dissenting narratives, saving the stories of the Midnight Schools becomes eerily prescient. The Harlem Historical Society's interactive exhibit, where visitors decode messages hidden in replica mill gears, doesn't just teach history. It trains critical skills for navigating misinformation today. When a Berlin museum displays a hollowed-out cheese wheel used to smuggle anatomical drawings, It's not simply showcasing cleverness, it's demonstrating how creativity outmaneuvers censorship in any era. Perhaps most moving are the collaborations with descendants. A recent exhibition in Leiden featured a 17th century poetry collection, its margins filled with coded debate notes, displayed alongside video of the poet's great-great-granddaughter, a contemporary physics professor reflecting on how intellectual courage shaped her family's trajectory. These connections make tangible what's at stake, not just preserving the past, but honoring the unbroken chain of curiosity that still lights the way forward. The work remains unfinished. Archaeologists still scour disused mills with ground-penetrating radar, hoping to uncover hidden compartments. Linguists pore over folk tales for encrypted scientific concepts. Every recovered fragment, whether a child's slate buried in a wall or a merchant's ledger with clandestine accounting, adds another piece to history's most extraordinary jigsaw puzzle. One where the picture emerging isn't just about how knowledge survived, but why it was worth risking everything to protect. These efforts remind us that memory is never passive. It's always a choice, and sometimes the most radical choice of all. The story of the Midnight Schools isn't just a fascinating historical footnote, it's a mirror reflecting urgent truths about our own time. In an age where algorithms dictate what we see and governments wage wars over narratives, the struggles of those 17th century scholars feel unsettlingly familiar. They grappled with a world where certain ideas were deemed too dangerous to circulate, where authorities controlled the flow of information under the guise of protecting society. Sound familiar, the parallels between their battles and ours against censorship, propaganda, and the weaponization of ignorance are too striking to ignore. What makes their example so vital today isn't just their defiance, but their ingenuity. Faced with impossible odds, they didn't just hide knowledge, they reinvented how it could be shared. When books were burned, they committed texts to memory. When classrooms were raided, they turned windmill gears into teaching tools. Their creativity under pressure offers a blueprint for navigating our own information crises. Imagine if today's fact-checkers and investigative journalists adopted their knack for embedding truths in unexpected places, not just in articles, but in games, music, even social media trends. The Midnight Schools prove that when truth is under siege, survival depends on adaptability as much as courage. Their legacy also challenges our assumptions about where real learning happens. We often equate education with institutions, schools, universities, official certifications. But those windmill classrooms remind us that knowledge thrives wherever curious minds gather, whether in physical hideouts or digital spaces. Modern equivalents might be the encrypted chat rooms where activists share banned news, or the underground networks teaching suppressed histories in authoritarian states. The lesson here is profound. Formal systems can gatekeep, but they can't monopolize understanding. True learning will always find cracks in the walls. Most importantly, these hidden schools demonstrate the unbreakable link between intellectual freedom and human progress. Every scientific breakthrough, every social advancement in our world today exists because someone, somewhere, refused to stop questioning. The Midnight Schools kept that spirit alive during Europe's darkest hours of dogma, ensuring that when the winds of change finally came, the seeds of enlightenment were ready to sprout. Today, as misinformation clouds public discourse and education becomes politicized, their story asks us, what ideas are we willing to protect? Which truths would we risk everything to pass on? The urgency of their example resonates in small acts of defiance everywhere. A teacher slipping banned books to students, a journalist publishing leaks despite threats, a parent teaching their child critical thinking at the kitchen table. These are the modern heirs of the windmill scholars, proving that the battle for truth isn't fought just in grand gestures, but in countless quiet decisions to seek, share, and safeguard knowledge. The midnight schools didn't just preserve the past, they lit a torch for the future, one that still burns wherever people dare to think freely. The midnight schools did far more than keep pages from burning, they proved that knowledge is wildfire. Once an idea takes root in even a single determined mind, no army can fully erase it. These hidden classrooms were never just about preserving old texts, they were about protecting the very possibility of curiosity itself. In the flickering candlelight of those windmills and cellars, students and teachers weren't just memorizing facts. They were rehearsing a radical proposition that the human mind refuses to be governed. Today, their legacy lives wherever people resist the silencing of thought. It's in the Afghan girls studying physics in secret basement schools after the Taliban banned their education. It's in the Hong Kong protesters using Morse code flashes and paper airplanes to share news when the internet is censored. It's even in the quiet acts of librarians who slip banned books into the hands of readers under oppressive regimes. The tools have changed. Encrypted apps replace hollowed-out millstones. VPNs stand in for coded laundry signals, but the defiance remains the same. What makes their story so vital now isn't just its drama, but its humility. These weren't mythical heroes, they were millers and midwives, students and shopkeepers, people who simply believed that a life without learning wasn't worth living. Their greatest lesson wasn't in the subjects they taught, but in the choice they made every night to light a candle despite the wind, to whisper when shouting was forbidden, to plant seeds they might never see bloom. That choice echoes today in every classroom where a teacher encourages critical thinking despite restrictive curricula, in every journalist who risks everything to report the truth, in every citizen who questions instead of obeys. The midnight schools didn't just survive their dark age, they helped end it. And as we face our own battles over what can be taught, read, or believed, their story whispers across centuries. The future belongs not to those who burn books, but to those who keep passing them on. So the next time you walk past an old windmill, remember, those creaking sails once covered voices debating the shape of the cosmos. The ordinary can hide the extraordinary. The quietest places sometimes shelter the loudest ideas, and no matter how dark the night, there will always be those who strike a match, turn a page, and dare to ask, what if? Now it's your turn. Where do you see the spirit of the midnight schools in our world today? A local librarian defending banned books, a student protesting censorship. Share your stories below, because history isn't just something we study, it's something we continue together. Don't forget to subscribe for more journeys into the forgotten corners where courage and curiosity meet. The next chapter might surprise